Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy Living live stream. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Kaufman. Today, we're going to be talking about diagnostic tests. But before I go there, let me remind everyone that I do regular myth-busting sessions, masterclasses, and Q&A inside my True Living Fellowship membership platform, which is now in open enrollment. So if you want more of this type of content, debunking mainstream medicine, as well as talking about natural healing, then please check out the link for my True Living Fellowship in the show notes and on my homepage. All right, so today's topic of diagnostic tests is quite interesting and important. And many people come to me with all kinds of test results that they believe indicates they have a health problem. But how do we actually know what is normal in terms of substances in the body, like levels of hormones, for example? How do we know what normal anatomy and physiology is? There are many things that can affect this, such as our lifestyle. For example, if we are a performance athlete, then our body may run differently than if we're a couch potato. What if we are in the process of healing in our body? Certainly, that will present different levels of different substances. What if we have a different culture or we're of a different race? Are there differences that we have to consider? So there are some major dilemmas and obstacles in the way of developing such a diagnostic test. And I'm going to in today's talk, review some problems. But first, I'm going to discuss exactly how diagnostic tests come into existence. What are the regulatory processes and how are they followed with respect to the science? And then I'm going to highlight several case studies of examples where diagnostic and screening tests can lead you in the wrong direction and cause you peril. And lastly, I'm going to discuss with you how you can actually assess the status of your own health, and so that you are not dependent on these diagnostic and screening tests. Now, let me just say that at the onset that there are a few tests and there are some circumstances when a diagnostic test can be useful. But those are limited, and I'm not talking about for screening purposes. And let me just define that screening is when a test is applied to the general population. In other words, you don't have any signs or symptoms of a health problem, but we are just testing everyone across the board to see if you have a problem. So in my opinion, those are not valid procedures. But let's say that we do have a particular symptom or health issue, and that makes us think of some possibilities of what could be causing it or what organ system could be involved. And there happens to be diagnostic tests available that may lend additional information to that situation. That is a reasonable use of a diagnostic test because it will either confirm or deny your suspicion of what is going on, and that may give you more confidence to pursue a certain course of treatment. Also, if there is a demonstrated abnormality that is measurable by some kind of diagnostic test, this can be used to follow the progress when it's not obvious from the person's experience. For example, blood sugar with people who have diabetes, following the blood sugars over time as you go through a treatment protocol can help you determine your progress before you notice a reduction in the symptoms of diabetes. So those applications are sometimes helpful, but not predominantly what we're discussing today. So the first problem that I want to bring up is the difficulty of determining what are the normal values or the reference range of a particular test. And this occurs, to all kinds of tests, including imaging studies. but it's more easy to understand when we're talking about normal lab values. So in other words, a blood test is said to be normal between 10 and 15. But what does that actually mean and how is it determined? So one thing to consider is to make this determination, generally the formula or recipe is to perform the test on a sample population. However, there are a number of factors to consider when you're setting up the sample population. One is that operating conditions may be different at different locations. There could be non-standardized ways of selecting who's a healthy patient because there is no fully objective and reproducible way to designate people from the general population who's healthy and who's not healthy. Although I'm going to teach you my opinion and philosophy about that approach at the end of this discussion. Patient populations are different. In one area, you may have people of a different culture, different race, different economic status, different lifestyle. They may be living near different types of industries that may be exposed to pollution, which may alter their test results. Climate, altitude, barometric pressure, humidity, time zone, the way the sample is collected and prepared. So all of these factors can influence the results. Now, with respect to using a sample population, how many people do we include in the sample population? And of course, there's no objective standard, but there are different consensus standards. So one group, the NCCLS, recommends at minimum of 120 subjects, but other experts recommend a minimum of 200, and there are certainly more opinions even than that. So once we have a sample population and we choose an arbitrary number of people and have arbitrary determinants that those are healthy people in that area, what do we do with the results to determine what the normal range is? Well, what's done is a statistical analysis. And this is essentially a mathematical model rather than an actual real life determinant of what's occurring in nature. And whether it's done parametrically or non-parametrically, and that those words are just for the statisticians out there, generally 95% of the normal values is what's considered the normal range. So by definition, when they have an opinion about the normal ranges and state those by lab determination, they don't include 5% of people who are actually normal. So when you get your result, how do you know if you're within that 5% where you have a quote unquote abnormal result, but it actually represents a normal state of health with respect to that lab test? And these can be called false positives or false negatives, depending on which direction they're false. And a false positive value is when the test produces a positive result in someone who does not have the health condition. And a false negative is when someone has the condition, but the test produces a negative or normal result. Now, even though there are these many perils with using a statistical model to determine the normal range, not all tests are done by this. Many normal ranges are determined by consensus. And the bodies that determine these consensus normal values may not even be official medical professionals. For example, the reference ranges for blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C, which are both related to diabetes, are determined by the American Diabetic Association, which is a private non-for-profit organization. And of course, it's very subjective because, how do you obtain a consensus? I'm sure that they didn't ask every single doctor and medical scientist on the planet, right? It's just among their select group, it's considered a consensus. So we see that just the issue of determining what are the normal values is fraught with many, many errors, biases, and is not based on the reality or scientific observation of nature, but rather mathematical modeling, people's opinions, and consensus. Now, before the normal values are formally determined, a test, in order to be used, must have some kind of scrutiny or studies that show that it's a valid test, or so you would think. Now, for a diagnostic test to gain approval from the FDA in order to be licensed and sold under the FDA, of course, the first step is to perform what's called a validation study. And a validation study is simply a way to determine, does this test actually measure what it's claimed to measure? And if we could bring up the first slide, Alexander. Sorry, I'm going to put this on my screen here so I can read it more clearly. So here's a flow chart that describes the classic standard way to perform a validation study. And you can see that you have at the top a new index test, and all of the patients or participants undergo the new test, which is the one that you're trying to validate, and the gold standard, which is the gold standard way of assessing that particular diagnosis. So let's say, for example, that we wanted to use this procedure to validate the PSA test, the prostate specific antigen, which is a very commonly used screening test for prostate cancer. The gold standard for prostate cancer would be a prostate biopsy, and more specifically, a sextant biopsy, where they take they divide the prostate into 6 sections and take a piece from each section, and then determine under a microscope if there is cancer. And that may actually not even be the gold standard, because really you'd have to follow that individual over time and see if the tumor grows and becomes invasive, but will accept the biopsy. So you would have to compare the prostate specific antigen or PSA test to actual biopsies of cancer and determine how it correlates in order to validate a PSA test. So it's pretty self-explanatory. In other words, you have to show that it actually measures what it's claimed to measure, and you do that by comparing it to the gold standard. But if we look at the next slide, we find that many diagnostic tests are actually not validated and not reviewed by the FDA. And I'm going to just read from this article from the Pew Research Foundation, because in there, it refers to lab diagnostic tests that are not approved by the FDA as LDT or lab determined tests. And it says here, lab determined tests have been developed for a wide range of conditions, including infectious diseases such as COVID-19, as well as different types of cancer. Because laboratory determined tests are not centrally registered or tracked, however, no one knows precisely how many of them are on the market, when and why they are used, or how their performance compares to FDA-reviewed diagnostics. So we see that there are quite a number of these kinds of tests, including especially in infectious disease. And one of the things that I had mentioned many times about the diagnostic tests for COVID-19 is that they were never validated or approved by the FDA, and they were allowed to be sold under an emergency use authorization. Alternatively, and if we go to the next slide, I'm going to read a little bit more from this article. This approach to oversight was more appropriate in 1976 when Congress first granted FDA authority. So in other words, there were no approvals or licensing before 1976. So lab determined tests were much more accepted and used before there were standards for validation and error rates put forth by the FDA. But today it says lab determined tests are increasingly used to identify and manage the treatment of more common and serious diseases, and where the risks posed by inaccurate results are dangerously high, such as for cancer, prenatal conditions, and genetic diseases. So in other words, there is no oversight and no need to prove that these diagnostic tests are valid, but they're still used routinely in serious life-threatening conditions. Once limited to patients near one lab, lab-determined tests can now reach millions of consumers thanks to the internet, shipping, and advances in at-home specimen collection. So yes, it is true. Many of the at-home diagnostics, including genetic testing, that you or others that you know may have participated in, are not validated tests. And although some LDTs are developed from scratch to meet medical needs for which there are no in vitro diagnostics, and in vitro diagnostics is the term they use for FDA reviewed and approved tests, other labs create LDTs by modifying FDA reviewed tests in many cases to reduce operating costs. So in other words, they take something that's approved, make it cheaper to run, but don't go back and prove that it's a valid modification to the protocol. So you can see that there is a lack of transparency of which tests are FDA approved versus which aren't. Many unapproved tests are used clinically in very serious conditions, and there is an unknown degree of error. And as I've claimed before, at least some of these tests are completely invalid and meaningless. Okay, so I want to now discuss 3 case studies, and these are all based initially on my personal experience, but I do have research articles to back all of them up. And the first case is a situation I noticed when I was in my, and we're not ready quite yet for that, Alexander, but I noticed when I was in my psychiatric training, and then later when I was a practicing emergency psychiatrist, which I just did part-time, but I had medical students that I was teaching at a dedicated psychiatric emergency department in Syracuse, New York. And I had always learned since my early training that a hypothyroidism or a low thyroid level was very uncommon, and almost all cases were caused because the person had a hyperthyroid condition like Graves' disease, and then they received treatment with surgical removal of the thyroid gland or with a radioactive iodine to kill the thyroid tissue. But now I was seeing all of these psychiatric patients presenting to the emergency department with, a crisis of depression or psychosis or substance abuse. And it seemed like more than half of the patients were taking thyroid hormone. And I thought, oh my God, this is really not what I was taught. This is way, way more common. And I was thinking, is there some really strong connection with thyroid disease and psychiatric illness? And the problem here is that if thyroid disease is misdiagnosed and someone is given treatment with thyroid hormone, every other health practitioner that is ever going to come in contact with that patient is going to look at the situation as that thyroid hormone is needed for their survival. So you can never question it or take it away, only adjust the dose if needed. So after considering this and then doing some research, I came across this article from what's known in psychiatry as the Green Journal. As you can see, it uses a green bar, or the American Journal of Psychiatry. And this is looked at as a very reputable journal. And this paper was actually written by endocrinologists. And I just want to read you what they wrote because they stated it quite powerfully here. So, up to 1/3 of psychiatric patients may demonstrate thyroid function test abnormalities that do not reflect true thyroid disease, but rather are a manifestation of secondary effects on one or more levels of hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. So in other words, their psychiatric illness caused their lab values to be perturbed into the abnormal range, but it doesn't represent any thyroid disease. Let me continue. Thus, Any abnormal thyroid function test in psychiatric patients should be viewed with skepticism. Given the fact that thyroid function test abnormalities seen in non-thyroidal illness usually resolve spontaneously, treatment is generally unnecessary and may even be potentially harmful. And that's exactly what I witnessed in my psychiatric practice, that all of these individuals were put on thyroid hormone because it is a standard screening test for all emergency psychiatric presentations to test the thyroid function. And of course, it was abnormal in many of those patients because that's what happens in a psychiatric crisis. But the doctors misinterpreted that and started them on thyroid hormone, and they remain on thyroid hormone even though it is potentially harmful. And I'll say that it's actually harmful, not potential. So there's one excellent example of how a screening test can be misleading and result in quite a bit of harm. And let me just say that for those individuals out there who were given thyroid hormone when they didn't actually have thyroid disease, that there are safe ways that you can taper off that medication and reestablish a completely normal thyroid function. So I want to bring up another example from my experience as well, and this has to do with miscarriage. Now, I was taught in medical school, and I found an article here. There are many articles to back this up, that if you suspect a miscarriage, in addition to an ultrasound, there's a laboratory blood test that you can conduct if it's in the first trimester. And it's called the quantitative serum beta HCG. Now, beta HCG, you might recognize as the pregnancy hormone. And when you do a urine or blood pregnancy test, it simply tests if this hormone is present or not. But for the purpose of assessing a miscarriage, you have to do what's called a quantitative level, where you get the actual amount of the pregnancy hormone in the blood. And what we are taught is that during the first trimester, the number is supposed to keep going up. In fact, it keeps doubling. And this is a way that you can assess sometimes the health and viability of the pregnancy. And I want to read from this article talking about using it to diagnose miscarriage. In general, however, if the HCG levels are dropping in the first trimester, this is probably a sign of an impending miscarriage. So I had a client who was in the first trimester, and she had a little bit of spotting and a clot. And she was concerned that it could be a miscarriage, but she did not want to do an ultrasound because if it was a viable pregnancy, then that there could be potential harm from an ultrasound. So she decided with her midwife to do the serial quantitative beta HCG test. And even though only 2 blood values are recommended, she did 3 upon the recommendation of her midwife. And what happened is, from the first to the second, the level went down. And from the second to the third, the level went down. So the midwife concluded that this represents a miscarriage, but there were still part of the fetus that was inside because not enough material had passed. So this woman decided to go get an ultrasound now, that to see how much was left and if she should consider having a procedure to remove the remaining unviable fetus. And when she got in the room and the ultrasonographer got the image, immediately was seen a healthy baby. So this was a very close call because she could have gone and got a D&C procedure to scrape out the remaining context of the miscarriage. So thankfully, she went and got an ultrasound first and ultimately had a healthy baby several months later. So once again, you can see that there is a serious potential for danger in this situation. So let me bring up one more example involving women's health, and this is related to breast cancer screening. Now, when I was in my surgical rotation in medical school is when I first noticed this, because the experience that medical students have in the surgery rotation is once they finish with their duties on the wards, they get to go to the OR and hopefully scrub in on a surgical case, which is the most exciting thing, that you can watch the surgery and maybe even assist on it. And in the surgical suite of a typical hospital, they have a whiteboard that is the schedule for the day. So which procedure is going to be in which operating room and who is the surgeon. And of course, the name of the patient as well. Now, I looked at this board and I remember the first day that half of all of the surgery schedules for that day said needle LOC BRBX. And I was like, what is this needle loc thing that's taking up half of the operating rooms, half of the day, every day? And I learned that it was a needle localization breast biopsy. So this is the situation where women have mammograms as a screening test for breast cancer. And then if there is something suspicious on the mammogram, many times they get sent for a biopsy. And I could not believe how many of these biopsies were being performed. And I realized then, or I learned more about mammography, that there is a lot of subjectivity to how mammograms are interpreted. And I'm not even going to get into the potential harm of radiation exposure from mammograms. We're just talking about the harm of breast cancer screening. So I came across this article from UC Davis Health. Now, the reason why I'm presenting this news article rather than the scientific study is because the authors of the scientific study basically didn't really interpret their results appropriately. They were comparing two different types of mammography screening and saying which one had fewer false positive results. But this article makes a strong statement about the real takeaway message of this study, and I'll read. A study led by UC Davis Health has found that half of all women will experience at least one false positive mammogram over a decade of annual breast cancer screening with 3D mammography. So in other words, if you follow the doctor's advice and once you hit the age that they recommend screening, you go every year, you will in 10 years be 50% likely to have a false positive. Now, what happens when you get a mammogram result that says, oh, we are suspicious that there may be breast cancer? And on the next slide, I found an article from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force about breast cancer screening. And here's what they wrote. Potential harms of screening mammography include false positive results, which may lead to psychological harms, additional testing, and invasive follow-up procedures like breast biopsies, overdiagnosis and overtreatment of lesions that would not have led to health problems in the absence of detection by screening and radiation exposure. So they admit the radiation exposure is a problem. And basically what they're saying is that women may actually undergo treatment for breast cancer when they don't actually have breast cancer. Now, I want to say that there's a type of quote unquote breast cancer, ductal carcinoma in situ, that 10 years ago, every case was treated with chemotherapy and surgery. But it's been determined that people with that condition have no health issues. So now you would think that no one is offering treatment for this condition. However, it's still very commonly treated with surgery and chemotherapy and radiation, even though it is shown to have the same survival rate as the general population. Now, if we go to the next slide and look at table 2 from this paper, this talks about a study, actually 2 studies, one including all women and one only including Black women. Each study has 1,000 women in it, and looks like they got somewhere between 10 and 16 mammograms over the course of this study. And I want to look clearly at the results here. Now, they claim that it actually prevented some breast cancer deaths, 8, 6, 10, and 9.2. Okay, out of 1,000, these are each out of 1,000 women. Now, if we look at the column all the way to the right of overdiagnosis, we see that the amount of women who were overdiagnosed, which means that they were told they have breast cancer when they didn't, and most likely they received treatment, was roughly almost twice as many as actually were supposedly saved from death, according to this screening. Well, that's quite interesting that you're 2 times as likely to receive unnecessary treatment for cancer that you don't have than have your life be quote unquote saved by getting this screening. And I also want to look at the number of false positive results in the next to last column, because you can see that they exceed the number of women in the study. So there were more false positive results than there were with women in the study, which means that there were women who had more than one false positive result during the course of this study. So this is quite a significant problem and dilemma for women who may be concerned about breast cancer. So if we can't trust screening tests to tell us if we are healthy or not, and we don't want to subject ourselves to all of the real and potential harms from misleading test results, how can we tell if we're actually healthy? Well, we certainly need to develop better listening to our body. One of the aspects of our modern culture is that we're so busy and our attention is captured by electronic devices, for example, and other modern inventions, that we neglect our own body signals. We delay using the bathroom because it's inconvenient. We ignore our thirst because it's more important to keep working, et cetera, down the line. So one is to try to cultivate a better observation and listening to your body's signals about how you feel. Also look at your level of functioning. Are you able to perform everything that you want to do in your life physically, or to the average of what you would expect to be able to perform? So can you engage in athletic activities? Can you sprint? Can you run? Can you lift things? Can you perform chores and cleaning? Can you do things that reflect your cognitive skills, like organization and planning, shop for a meal, get the ingredients, put everything together in a sequence of steps? If there's no deficit in your level of functioning, even a small one, chances are that there's no deficit in your state of health. However, when you're doing this, it's important to be fully honest with yourself and not ignore those little nuisance things that perhaps you just accepted as part of life or part of aging, but these are actually indications of a state of ill health. One that's very important is the state of your oral health. If you have issues with your teeth or gums or other issues in your mouth, that represents that there's also issues elsewhere in your body, and you need to take those seriously. But things like hemorrhoids, having heavy menstrual periods, recurrent skin conditions you can't get rid of, joint and back pains and tweaks, waking up to pee 3 times a night. These are just some examples of symptoms that we may experience that we kind of dismiss as a nuisance or as a normal aging process. However, these are subtle indicators of a health problem that if you address it now, it will not become a bigger health problem in the future. But you don't need a lab test to tell you about those things. They're from your direct observation and experience. So today I have discussed a lot of the difficulties, obstacles, and flaws of diagnostic testing, especially for screening purposes. I've talked a bit about how normal values are determined, about how a test is validated and gets FDA approved, how many tests out there are not validated and not FDA approved. And I gave you specific examples of specific tests that are very misleading and have led to dangerous and harmful situations in the people subjecting themselves to those tests. And lastly, I've given you some action steps you can take to assess your own health without getting involved in this type of diagnostic dilemma. All right, Alexander, why don't we take a few questions?
Right, very well done, Andy. I really enjoyed your presentation. We have many questions out there, but we'll leave it down to we'll cut it down to 3 questions for now, given the time. So let's go to Mindy first. Are there any reliable tests like blood or saliva tests to determine hormone levels?
Well, I'm kind of glad you brought this up, Mindy, because I think hormone levels are one of the most difficult things to assess with tests because they generally fluctuate throughout the course of the day. So, and the additional factor of time is paramount in assessing these. But I really, my opinion is that these tests are not very useful, but you can simply know by the experience of the individual if there is an abnormality in the hormone. The other thing is if hormone levels are abnormal and associated with some kind of health issue, that gives the impression that the body is broken in some way and it's not making the right amount of hormone or secreting the right amount of hormone. But that's simply not the case, in my opinion. The way I look at it is that the body is doing exactly what it needs to restore itself to an optimal health condition. And the body is always trying to restore and achieve optimal health and functioning. And sometimes that may require changing the hormone expression in order to achieve that. And there may be insults such as toxicity, like with xenoestrogens, for example, that can adversely influence our body's own hormone system, and our body has to react to that in order to heal properly. So my approach would be that you can, one, recognize the nature of the problem by the individual's experience of symptoms, and then you can assess what is the underlying cause that could result in this abnormality, and simply address that directly. But I don't think that it's a good idea to simply give replacement hormones to an individual, because that only works if under the presumption that the body is broken and can't determine by itself what the appropriate amount of hormone should be for its own use.
Right. Let's go to Sandy. Is that a blood pressure number that you consider a real health risk?
No, there is not. And this is one of those normal reference values that is determined by consensus rather than any objective fact in nature. And just over the course of my relatively short career as a physician, spanning about, and as a physician assistant, so since about 95, so 25 or so years, I've seen those numbers change many times, and they only go in one direction. In other words, the number that's considered normal gets lower and lower and lower. And this is a great way to sell more blood pressure lowering medications. The truth is that the blood pressure is regulated by your body to make sure that enough blood gets to your organs and tissues to provide nutrients and remove waste products. And depending on the state of your body, that requirement can change to overcome other obstacles. And it may be a useful way of assessing your health if it is in the condition of there's a problem, and it could be related to blood pressure, or blood pressure could be a result of this problem. So let's look at the blood pressure and see if it confirms our suspicion, or to follow your treatment over time. And the blood pressure actually has another use, that it can help assess your intravascular volume or your level of hydration. But there's a special equation you have to use to determine that.
Right. Very nice answer, Andy. Okay, let's go to Polygon. What are your thoughts on Lugol's iodine? How bromines and halides, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, block iodine in the body?
Yes, that is true. And if you're eating processed foods and things, for example, with brominated flours and other products, you certainly can adversely influence your system, including with iodine absorption or other problems related to iodine. Also, some quote unquote superfoods like kale actually have substances in them that can take iodine out of your body. But I don't recommend Lugol's iodine per se, because it's not something that's found in nature. In nature, the source of iodine is generally food from the sea, fish, shellfish, and sea vegetables. Although there are some land animals that may also have decent levels of iodine, I believe things like snails, but please do double check me on that.
Right. Andy, that was absolutely fantastic. Do you want to say anything before we close it off?
Well, let me just remind people to look into my True Living Fellowship, where you can get a lot more content like this. And also I explore areas beyond health and medical science, including family relations and other types of relationships, our relationship with nature, spirituality, law, and government, and a couple of other things that are escaping me right now. So please check out the True Living Fellowship, and I look forward to seeing you back next week for another Healthy Living live stream.
Cheers, everybody. Have a good time.